The river stopped breathing. It did not rage or roar. It did not split its banks or drag trees from their roots. It simply went still, as if some vast unseen hand had pressed a finger to its lips and commanded silence. All winter it had muttered beneath crusted reeds and dead cattails, a low and constant murmur that villagers slept to and woke beside. But on this night, the sound was gone. The current's whisper had hardened into nothing. The moon cast its pale authority across a surface no longer rippling, but gleaming, flat, glassy, unblinking. A white road stretched from bank to bank. Old Mathis the ferryman crouched at the edge and pressed his palm against it. He had known this river in flood and in drought. He had ferried men fleeing famine, soldiers fleeing defeat, lovers fleeing fathers with knives. He had watched kings change like seasons and remembered the price of salt in each reign. The river had always answered him with movement. Now it answered with stone. Frost had stitched it shut. The fog that rose from it did not curl or wander as it once had. It clung, heavy and intimate, as if the cold itself had hands. It crept into wool and through leather. It salted beards with rime and sealed eyelashes together. The ferryman tasted iron in the air, sharp and thin. Across the valley, beneath that hard moon, shapes gathered. They arrived not together, but in wary procession, as though summoned by the river's sudden quiet. From the south came men who prayed in Latin and stitched saints into their banners. Their mail glimmered dull beneath a crust of frost. Their priests carried relics wrapped in silk, stiffened by the cold. From the north came men whose words cut like axes, harsh syllables that cracked the air. Wolf pelts hung over their shoulders, stiff with ice. Their shields bore beasts with bared teeth. From the west came men in the court French of their lords, though their own tongues were rough with peasant vowels. Their hose were patched, their boots stuffed with straw. Blood seeped through cloth where frostbite had bitten deep and black. 3 armies, 3 vows, 3 sets of banners sagging under the same rhyme. Their horses steamed when they first halted, breath rising like ghostly offerings. Then even that steam faded, as if warmth itself had been reconsidered and withdrawn. Campfires were coaxed from damp wood, but the flames snapped blue and small. Tallow candles guttered, weeping in lantern cages. Bread froze hard between hand and mouth. The night smelled of onion stew congealing in iron pots, of wet leather turning brittle, of fear kept carefully behind teeth. Mathis watched them from his bank, wrapped in a cloak older than some of the soldiers, now stamping their feet against the cold. He saw engineers step forward, men with ash poles and measuring cords, practical men who believed in weight and thickness and the arithmetic of survival. They tested the ice with the butts of their pikes, listening. A solid knock. Another. They leaned low, ears close to the frozen skin, waiting for the hollow drum that meant death. Captains argued by torchlight. Gloved fingers pointed toward the white expanse. A frozen river was a gift, some said, a miracle laid down by Providence. Others saw only a trap disguised as mercy, a door never meant to open. And doors invite men who believe they are chosen. Orders began to move from mouth to mouth, carried like embers in cupped hands. Each repetition grew thinner, less certain. Boys led oxen, dragging carts, heavy with corals and stones. Wheels squealed against the frost. Priests murmured blessings over spokes and harness straps, their breath turning holy words into clouds. Near one wagon, a surgeon sharpened his knife against a whetstone already slick with ice. The rasping sound cut through the quiet like a promise. Above it all, the river lay still. At midnight, the first column stepped forward. Boot met ice. There was a sound, low, almost reverent. A groan that seemed to rise not from the surface, but from beneath the earth itself, as if some buried bell had been struck far below. Mathis felt it in his teeth. Men paused, glancing at one another. A captain barked something sharp and angry, and the line resumed its slow procession. Shields shifted. Spearheads caught the moonlight and fractured it into cold shards. A lone crow descended to the ice and paced along the white road of moonlight, head cocked, as though counting. The groan deepened. Not loud, not yet, but patient. The ferryman's hand moved unconsciously to the rusted key hanging at his belt, the key to his boat, drawn up high on the bank since the freeze began. It was a heavy key, black with age, once the measure of his livelihood. Now it unlocked nothing. No water would carry him tonight. He remembered another winter, another king, a crossing attempted in desperation. He remembered screams swallowed by current red spreading beneath broken ice like spilled dye. He had shouted then. Tonight, he did not. The second rank of soldiers moved onto the river. Oxen followed, hooves uncertain. The ice sang again, higher this time, strained thin as drawn wire. A crack lanced outward, delicate as a hair across glass. Men froze. Torches flickered in a sudden wind that seemed to come from nowhere, sweeping low across the valley. The fog shifted, parted, and revealed the armies fully to one another for the first time. Three forces poised upon a single breath. Somewhere, a horse screamed. The crack widened, not enough to swallow a man, not yet, but enough to whisper what waited beneath. Black water blinked through the seam, glistening like an eye forced open. The captains shouted conflicting commands. Advance. Halt. Back. The words collided in the air and fell useless at their feet. The crow lifted, wings beating once, twice, and vanished into the dark. Mathis did not call out. He knew the river's moods the way a shepherd knows his flock. This was no mere freeze. This was judgment suspended, waiting for weight. Another fissure split the surface, racing sideways with a sound like tearing cloth. A cartwheel slipped. An ox stumbled. Men reached for one another and found only mail and cold. The groan became a crack, thin as a hair, sharp as a blade. For a breathless heartbeat, everything held. The moon shone steady. The banners sagged motionless. The valley seemed to lean in. Mathis tightened his grip on the rusted key and felt the uselessness of it, felt the end of ferries and the beginning of something far less certain. The river had turned from passage into verdict, and as the first plank of ice gave way beneath iron and flesh, as the surface buckled like a chest collapsing inward, the old ferryman closed his eyes, not in fear, but in recognition. Because when a river falls silent, it is not the absence of sound that should terrify men. It is the waiting. And in that waiting, beneath the splintering ice and the rising cries, something older than kings began to stir. Something that would outlast banners and vows alike. The valley would remember this night not as a battle, but as a turning. And beyond the broken river, beyond the drowning torches and the shattering white road, another story was already gathering in the dark. Of survivors, of blame, of oaths reforged in frost and blood. The ice had spoken. Now the living would have to answer. Snow did not fall. It descended. Not in flakes, but in a slow surrender of white, as if a burned heaven were shedding its last gray ash. It drifted into the folds of cloaks and gathered along the seams of helmets, softened spear points and blurred banners until the world below looked less like a battlefield and more like a shrouded altar prepared for sacrifice. From the narrow watch slit of a ruined toll house, a young scout held his breath inside his mouth so it would not glitter in the starlight and betray him. His teeth ached with the effort. Frost had gathered along his lashes, narrowing his vision to a trembling tunnel of white and black. Below him, the river stretched wide through the valley, feared, obeyed, trusted. Or at least it had been. The wind shifted, low and deliberate, brushing snow aside in a pale sweep. And there it was, the sheen. Not ripple, not rush. A single unbroken glaze catching the starlight like the flat of a blade. The scout swallowed hard. He had grown up on the proverb that the river was the valley's wall. A wall not built by masons, but by God and gravity. Armies might starve on one bank, but they would not reach the other without permission. Merchants paid their pennies at the iron chain stretched between posts, pilgrims crossed on creaking barges, and outlaws with loot tied to their backs sank into cold judgment when they mistook desperation for courage. The water had rules. Tonight, rules were breaking. He rubbed his numb fingers along the rough fletching of an arrow, grounding himself in the scrape of feather and wood. He listened. No frogs, no current, no gentle slap of water against stone, only the distant clank of harness. The muted cough of men trying to breathe through wool scarves stiffened into boards by frost. The slow, restless shifting of horses who could not understand why the world smelled wrong. 3 hosts were converging. They did not march together, but they arrived within the same hour, drawn as though by a rumor whispered through snow. From the south came men from a plague-touched city, where bells rang for the dead more often than for mass. Their faces were gaunt, hollowed by weeks of smoke and burial. Rosemary sprigs were pinned to their breasts as if scent could guard them against rot. They carried their fear like a relic, visible, reverent, heavy. From the east came men who had crossed marshland on hurdles and fascines, building their own earth beneath their boots. Their pavises were painted with crude suns, thick and yellow, as though to summon warmth from pigment. Their spears were long, their shoulders bent beneath them like branches under snow. From the west rode a prince's ambition. Scarlet surcoats gleamed dimly beneath frost. Spurs flashed gilt in the moonlight. A cart laden with wine barrels creaked behind them, guarded more fiercely than the wounded. They carried laughter that sounded brittle and sharp, as though daring the cold to crack it. They did not know one another's songs. Their prayers rose in different tongues. But hunger makes all songs sound the same in the end. The scout's captain had once told him, in a whisper meant to be remembered, watch for the moment when men stop seeing the land and start seeing omens. He saw it now. Heads tilted toward the river, not as soldiers assessing terrain, but as pilgrims gazing at a miracle. Hands reached out, hesitant, reverent, as though to brush the bone of a saint displayed behind glass. A frozen river meant speed. It meant surprise. It meant crossing before dawn and waking an enemy with steel at his throat. In the dark, clerks muttered Latin over a wooden cross, asking God to hold the ice steady beneath righteous feet. Nearby, gamblers crouched over a drumhead, throwing knucklebones with numb fingers, wagering how many carts would make it before the cracking began. Faith and chance sharing the same breath. The scout tasted iron. He had bitten his lip without knowing. Blood warmed his tongue for a moment, then cooled. He understood something the captains did not. Ice was not mercy. It was a thin agreement between cold and weight was coming. The first soldiers stepped onto the river cautiously, boots making a dry, papery sound like parchment being folded for a seal. The noise seemed small, almost polite. The river answered with a low moan. It traveled not across the surface, but beneath it, deep and resonant. The sound rose through the valley like a horn blown underground. Horses jerked their heads. A man crossed himself twice in quick succession. More followed. Spears angled forward. Shields shifted. A banner dipped as its bearer adjusted his grip against the slick surface. Snowflakes landed and melted into the glaze, freezing again as tiny imperfections, faint scars in the smooth skin. The scout's hands trembled now, not from cold, from understanding. 3 different wills, 3 ambitions sharpened on 3 different grindstones, had been invited onto one fragile surface. He imagined the river as a mirror laid flat upon the earth. In it, the moon floated unbroken. In it, torches shivered and multiplied. In it, men saw themselves doubled, steel and shadow walking side by side. And in that reflection, something was already breaking. A crack shot outward from beneath an ox's hoof, thin as a hairline in glass. It did not split wide. It did not swallow. It whispered. The prince's men pressed forward, unwilling to appear hesitant. The plague-marked soldiers followed, desperation pushing them like wind behind a sail. The marshland warriors stepped with measured caution, shields raised not against arrows, but against the possibility of cold black water. The moan deepened. The scout leaned farther from the watchtower slit, snow falling from the stones around him. He could see the ice bow slightly beneath the weight, a subtle sagging that only someone looking from height might notice. He wanted to shout, to warn, but he had been told to watch. And so he watched. The ice sang again, higher now, strained tight as wire drawn for a noose. A cartwheel slipped, metal rims screeching against frozen sheen. A horse's foreleg buckled, and the animal screamed, a sound too alive for the stillness surrounding it. Men shouted conflicting orders. Advance, back, hold. Their voices scattered across the open space and seemed to vanish before reaching either bank. The scout's breath finally escaped him in a trembling plume. It glittered once in the starlight and was gone. The crack widened. Not enough for disaster. Not yet. But enough to reveal a dark line beneath, like an eye forced open to watch its own undoing. He saw then what his captain had meant. The land was no longer earth and river and snow. It was sign. It was promise. It was temptation. And temptation has weight heavier than armor. The moonlight shifted as clouds passed thinly overhead, turning the river's surface from silver to dull gray. For a heartbeat, the ice looked less like a road and more like a lid over something patient. The scout pressed his forehead against the cold stone of the watchtower and closed his eyes. Below, the armies continued their cautious advance, each believing itself guided by destiny rather than chance. Each trusting the surface beneath them because to doubt it would be to doubt their own necessity. The river groaned again, long and low. And in that sound, the scout heard not warning, but reckoning. Because when men mistake silence for blessing, when they mistake stillness for consent, they step not onto opportunity, but onto judgment. The first true fracture had not yet come. But it was coming. And as the three hosts moved deeper onto the mirror of frozen starlight, the scout understood that by dawn, the valley would belong to neither side of the river. It would belong to the water beneath it. And what rose from that water would change more than the outcome of a battle. It would change what men believed about walls, about safety, about the thinness between faith and folly. He opened his eyes. The ice shuddered. And somewhere far below that fragile glaze, something answered. The bell for Compline rang into emptiness. Its bronze throat opened and released a note that should have been answered by the river's steady murmur, a soft, faithful companion to the hours. For generations, water had spoken back to stone. It had been the monastery's second clock, its low and constant hymn threading through prayer and sleep alike. But tonight, when the final vibration faded into the rafters, nothing returned. Silence lay where water should have been. In the scriptorium, winter lived in the ink. It thickened it, made it reluctant, as if even words feared to move. Brother Matthias bent over his parchment, his breath slow and careful so it would not scatter ash from the brazier at his side. The brazier burned more smoke than heat. The smoke rose in dark coils, staining the beams above like unanswered petitions. He dipped his quill and found the ink sluggish, clinging to the nib like tar. His fingers were numb despite the wool wrapped around them. He pressed them briefly over the brazier's mouth, where the coals glowed faintly red beneath a crust of gray. The warmth stung, then vanished. Outside, something had changed. The river, which had always spoken through thaw and flood and drought, had withheld its voice. Matthias lifted his head and listened. Nothing. The abbot felt it too. The old man's gaze drifted from the candlelit altar toward the shuttered windows as though he could see through oak and iron to whatever lay beyond. After the final prayer, he summoned Matthias and two lay brothers to the cloister walk. "Take bread," the abbot said quietly, "and dried peas. Charity keeps us honest, and witness keeps us humble. Witness." They stepped out into a world made fragile by snow. Their sandals crunched over frozen mud. Their wool habits drank in flakes until the hems grew heavy, clinging like pennants around their ankles. Breath smoked before their faces and dissolved. The path to the riverbank felt longer than it ever had. Villagers were already there. They stood in small knots along the shore, mouths open, as if the world had turned and shown them an unfamiliar face. Children clutched skirts, old men leaned on sticks, eyes narrowed. The river shone, not with motion, but with a hard, seamless glaze. It held the moon the way glass holds a candle flame. Still, captive, unwavering. Frost feathered its edges like white script no one had written. The smell struck Matthias first. Cold iron. Sap from freshly split wood. The faint sourness of reeds trapped beneath ice, pressed down into silence. He knelt and placed a hand near the surface without touching it. It did not ripple. It did not answer. From upriver came the First Army. Their banners were lowered against the wind, embroidered saints stiff with frost. Men tramped in disciplined lines, boots striking frozen earth in measured rhythm. Their breath rose in white columns, as though incense trailed from each mouth. A chaplain walked beside them, chanting Latin that cracked on the cold. The words wavered, but the cadence held. From downriver came the second. Rougher. Louder. Mercenaries whose mail did not match, whose axes were bound with rawhide. Their curses in Germanic tongues struck the air like stones against stones. Their laughter was sharp, but it did not reach their eyes. The third arrived late, escorted by riders whose bridles were adorned with tiny bells. The bells did not ring. The metal had stiffened, mute as a sealed confession. Scarlet cloaks brushed the snow. A prince's colors glimmered dull beneath frost. 3 armies, 3 sets of sins, all drawn to the same frozen threshold. Matthias had copied laws about bridges and tolls, clauses written in courtly French that named who might cross and who must pay. He had traced the careful loops of authority, the tidy sentences that assumed the river would remain obedient. None of those words had imagined a river that turned itself into a road. The captains approached the ice cautiously at first. Engineers tapped with pike butts. Men knelt and pressed gloved palms to the surface, listening for hollow betrayal. When the ice answered with a solid knock, relief passed like a current through ranks. Hope is a dangerous warmth. A goat was brought forward, bleeding thinly. Its throat was cut at the edge of the river. Blood steamed briefly before freezing in dark lace upon the glaze. Wine was poured over the ice, red spreading and then halting as it stiffened. Promises were spoken aloud, alms pledged, relics offered, prayers flung upward like coins tossed into a well. A woman from the village stepped toward Matthias. She pressed a small candle into his hands. "Bless him," she whispered. "My son. He rides with the prince." Her fingers trembled as they released the tallow. The candle smelled sweet and wrong in the iron air. Its flame bent sideways as if frightened by something unseen. Matthias murmured a blessing, though his voice felt small against the open sky. When the first wagons rolled onto the river, the sound was unbearable. Iron-rimmed wheels upon glass, a long, drawn-out groan traveled beneath the surface, rising through boots and bones. Villagers crossed themselves. One child began to cry and was quickly hushed. Matthias felt the vibration in his chest. The river was no longer water. It was page. And these men were writing upon it with their weight. Every step a sentence, every creak a warning in a language older than Latin. The chaplain's chant faltered as the ice sang back, a low moan that seemed to come from under the earth. The mercenaries' laughter died. Even the prince's riders grew still, their horses' nostrils flaring at a scent they did not trust. A hairline crack appeared near the shore. Thin, delicate, almost beautiful. It traveled outward in a pale vein, splitting the moon's reflection into trembling halves. Matthias's quill hand twitched. The urge to record seized him, not as habit, but as compulsion. To freeze this moment into ink before it shattered. To give shape to what felt like the hinge of something vast. Beside him, one of the lay brothers whispered, "It will hold." The words hung in the air like frost. Will it? More men pressed forward. Discipline, desperation, arrogance, each added its measure of weight. The goat's blood darkened further. The wine stain spread no more. The ice groaned again. Louder. A wagon lurched as a wheel slipped sideways. An ox bellowed, hooves skidding against the smooth surface. Commands were shouted, conflicting, urgent. Advance. Halt. Back. The words scattered like chaff. The bells on the prince's bridles remained silent. Matthias lifted his eyes to the sky. Clouds drifted thinly across the stars, dimming them one by one. Snow continued to descend, soft and unjudging, covering footprints along the bank, smoothing evidence as though preparing for confession. Another crack. This one sharper. The surface bowed ever so slightly under the gathered mass. A tremor passed through the ranks, invisible but felt. The monk realized then that the river had not changed for them. It had changed for itself. Men believed they were seizing opportunity. They believed the freeze was a gift, a door opened by Providence. But the river was no door. It was a threshold that remembered every footstep ever taken upon it. The first splinter of ice snapped upward with a sound like tearing parchment. A horse stumbled. A man fell to one knee, gauntlets skidding across the slick plain. The chaplain's cross slipped from his grip and struck the surface with a hollow knock. The villagers gasped in unison. Matthias clutched the candle tighter. Wax spilled onto his skin and hardened there, pale and cold. He understood then that no clause, no law, no blessing could command what lay beneath that glaze. Ink could record it. Prayer could name it, but neither could bind it. The river had become witness, and witness does not negotiate. As the ice shuddered under the compounded will of three armies, as the cracks began to weave themselves into a fragile map of consequence, Matthias felt the story closing around him, not as a tale to be told, but as a door swinging shut. He imagined the scriptorium, the waiting parchment, the thick, reluctant ink. How would he describe the sound of faith meeting weight? How would he capture the moment when a wall became a road, and a road became a reckoning? The ice groaned once more, long and low, like a bell rung beneath water. Matthias looked down at the river's fractured mirror and saw not soldiers but reflections already breaking apart. And as the first true fissure opened, like a wound beneath the moon, he understood that this was only the beginning. Because when the river chooses silence, it is not retreating. It is listening. And what it heard that night would echo far beyond the frozen threshold, into cloisters and courts, into sermons and songs, into the next chapter of a valley that would never again trust the stillness of water. She woke to a sound that was not sound, not a scream, not a horn, not the clash of steel that so often tore sleep apart in the dark hours before dawn. It was the absence of something older and steadier, the rush of water that had always threaded itself through the valley like a vein. Isabeau opened her eyes into frost. She had learned to sleep beside Armies the way other girls learned to sleep beside hearths. One eye open, one hand on what was hers. A blanket of patched linen wrapped her shoulders. Beneath it, two small bundles of bones and breath curled against her ribs. Her children. Their hair smelled of smoke and sour milk, their mouths parted in soft, fragile dreams. Around them, men snored into the cold. Others coughed, deep and wet. A few whispered prayers into wool sleeves. Some dreamed aloud of bread. Thick loaves split open with steam rising, butter melting into golden hollows. But beneath all of it, something was missing. The river. Even in winter, it had always moved, dark and muttering, dangerous and alive. Its voice was the one constant beneath the chaos of camp. It marked the hours better than any bell. Tonight, it lay silent. Isabeau pushed herself upright, careful not to wake the children. The snow beyond the tents did not fall so much as hover, drifting sideways in pale sheets. The moon hung thin and sharp, a blade laid across the sky. At the edge of camp, men were gathering. She wrapped the blanket tighter and rose, her bare feet finding frozen straw. Each step crunched. Each breath cut her throat. She carried a bundle of washed shirts beneath one arm, still stiff with cold, and a small pouch of needles tied to her waist, her tools, her living. At the riverbank, the world had changed. Where there should have been black movement and the soft slap of current against stone, there was a pale expanse, flat, unbroken. The moon lay upon it without trembling. A captain held a torch over the surface. The flame reflected back at him, cold and perfect. The ice did not drink the light. It returned it. Isabeau felt something tighten in her chest. A door had appeared where there had always been a wall. Men stamped their feet and knocked gauntlets together. Some laughed, but the laughter came out brittle and cracked midair. A priest lifted a wooden cross, murmuring Latin that wavered in the wind. A cook farther back scraped porridge from the bottom of a pot, the wooden spoon squealing like a trapped mouse against iron. The air smelled sharp, horse sweat turning sour, wool soaked through with snow, urine frozen into straw, tallow and smoke and hunger. Always hunger. She followed the crush of bodies closer to the shore. In the press, she heard languages collide. Norman French barking orders, Middle English pleading for more oats, Latin stitched through it all in an attempt to make the miracle sound lawful. Miracle. That was the word some dared to use. Others did not speak at all. They only stared at the frozen sheen as though it might shift beneath their gaze. Then, across the pale expanse, torches appeared. At first, they seemed like wandering stars. Then they resolved into a line, a necklace of fire moving along the far bank. From upstream came another column, helmets rained white, shields painted with saints' hands and pagan beasts alike. Isabeau had seen war before. She had washed the blood from shirts stiff with it. She had stitched torn sleeves and torn flesh with the same careful hands. But she had never seen 3 wars arriving at once. 3 sets of banners, 3 ambitions, each believing itself the center of God's gaze. She saw a scribe near the front, clutching a ledger to his chest as though numbers might shield him. A clerk who would tally spoils and deaths with equal ink. A barber surgeon tightening a leather strap around his kit, testing the weight of saw and knife. Boys, faces still soft, carrying bundles of arrows taller than their shoulders. Behind her, one of her children stirred and whimpered. She turned and pulled the blanket higher around their small forms. The order came. Not shouted at first, passed mouth to mouth, a current of will. Cross. The army moved as one body toward the ice. Boots touched the surface. There was a sound, low and long, like a deep instrument being strained beyond its tuning. Not water's rush, not wind's cry. The ice was singing. Isabeau stepped back instinctively, clutching the bundle of shirts to her chest. The cloth felt suddenly useless, thin against something so vast. Men advanced in disciplined lines. Horses hesitated, then obeyed the pressure of reins. Iron-rimmed wheels creaked onto the frozen plain. The ice groaned. A mule at the rear carried a small bell at its harness. The bell did not ring. Its metal tongue lay stiff and silent against its hollow throat. The silence of that bell was worse than any cry. A gust of wind lifted snow into Isabeau's eyes. She blinked against the sting, and through the blur she saw a single black bird settle upon the ice ahead of the first ranks. It stood calm and untroubled, as if presiding. Her lips moved without thought, forming a prayer no priest had taught her. Not Latin, not French. Let the river remember it is a river. More men stepped forward. From the far bank, the other armies began to edge onto the frozen threshold as well, drawn by the same temptation. If one could cross, why not all? If God had laid a road, who were they to refuse it? 3 forces upon one fragile skin. The ice answered with a sharper sound, a crack like lightning traveling beneath boots. It raced outward in a pale vein, splitting the moon's reflection into trembling halves. A horse reared. A man slipped and fell hard upon his side, shield skidding across the slick surface. Laughter burst from somewhere, high and nervous, and then died. Isabeau felt the night tilt. Not visibly, not enough for the eye to mark. But in her bones she felt it, the slow surrender of balance. The captain shouted for order. The priest raised his cross higher, voice breaking as he invoked saints whose names blurred in the cold. From the opposite bank, another commander bellowed commands in a tongue she did not know. The ice did not care for tongues. It groaned again, deeper now. A crack opened wider near the center, thin but unmistakable. Blackness gleamed through it. Water, patient and waiting. Isabeau's grip tightened on the blankets she had brought for her children. She imagined them beneath that surface, small bodies swallowed whole, hair floating like drowned reeds. The blackbird lifted once, beating its wings, and settled again farther out. Calm, unmoved. The ice sagged almost imperceptibly under the compounded weight. Wagons creaked. An ox bellowed. The mule's silent bell swung uselessly. Men were no longer seeing a road, they were seeing salvation. And salvation, when mistaken, becomes a trap. The first true fracture snapped open with a sound like splitting timber. A soldier vanished to his waist in dark water before he could even shout. Hands reached for him, gauntleted, desperate. The ice splintered further beneath the sudden shift. Screams tore through the valley. The river had found its voice. Isabeau staggered backward, dragging her children away from the edge. Snow blurred her sight again, and through it she saw iron and flesh flailing against a surface that no longer pretended to hold them. The world did not end. It tilted, and in that tilt, something fragile inside her hardened. She had followed armies for protection, for coin, for scraps of safety at the edges of violence. Now she understood there were no edges, only thresholds. The ice continued to crack in widening lines, splitting reflection from reflection, man from footing, prayer from promise. Isabeau clutched her children close and stepped farther into the dark behind the camp, away from the river's unraveling skin. Behind her, the groaning deepened into chaos. Before her, the valley lay open, snow-covered and uncertain. And as the river reclaimed its breath beneath the breaking glaze, Isabeau realized that by morning, nothing would remain as it had been. Not the armies, not the road of ice, not the illusion of walls. The river had remembered itself. Now the living would have to remember who they were without it. The crack did not begin as thunder. It began as a whisper beneath iron. Lord Edric felt it through the soles of his boots before he heard it with his ears, a thin complaint traveling upward through horse, saddle, and bone. The ice shifted under the foremost cart, and the sound threaded through the night like a question no one wished to answer. He had spent his life learning the weight of decisions, how a lifted finger could send 100 men forward into arrow flight, how a breath held for a heartbeat too long could save a banner from collapse, how mercy offered once could rot into weakness in the mouths of rivals who mistook patience for fear. The weight of this decision pressed him hard into the saddle. He had ridden to the river, expecting black water and delay, the choke point of ferries, the slow misery of carpenters building a bridge beneath hostile eyes. He had prepared himself for hunger, for negotiation, for the slow bleed of winter while enemies gathered strength. Instead, he found a plain of ice, wide as a tournament field, glittering beneath the stars like freshly honed steel. It was too clean, too simple. His captains crowded close, their breath rising in restless plumes. The master of horse warned of hooves that would slip and break. The engineer spoke of weight and stress as though the river were a beam in a carpenter's hall, muttering of thickness and span. The chaplain insisted that God had granted them a path, his voice trembling between awe and ambition. Behind them, men gnawed dried beef and hard cheese, washing it down with ale that had turned slushy in the barrel. They spat frost into the snow. The camp smelled of pitch, damp wool, iron from cuirasses and nail-studded boots. Hunger lingered beneath every breath. Edric listened and watched. Across the frozen expanse, torches flickered along the far bank. He had not marched alone into this winter. Rumors traveled faster than armies, a prince trapped by weather, a rival supply train mired in marsh, a rebel host desperate for a crossing. The river, feared because it took lives without malice, had drawn them all like a court summons. His squire stood at his knee, holding a small reliquary wrapped in cloth to keep the cold from cracking it. A splinter of wood said to be from a saint's coffin. The boy's knuckles were raw and split. His eyes flicked constantly between Edric's face and the ice. "My lord," the squire whispered, "it looks firm." Firm. Edric thought of the law of the land, inked on vellum and sealed with wax, the river as boundary, the river as defense. Peasants had paid tolls in eggs and smoked eels each spring to cross by ferry. Their world depended on this water remaining alive, moving, unpredictable, sovereign. Now it lay still. Dead. Useful. He hated gifts that came without price. An old tale stirred in his memory of a bridge built overnight by the devil, strong and flawless, paid for with the first soul to cross. The ice before him felt like that. An offer made in darkness, too smooth to be innocent. He ordered test men forward. Ash poles struck the surface. Each blow returned a dull, solid note. The engineer nodded once, twice. "It will hold the first ranks," he murmured. "Will hold. For how long?" Edric removed his gauntlet and pressed his bare palm against the hilt of his sword, feeling the cold seep into skin and sinew. He had delayed charges before. He had turned back from battlefields that promised only attrition and ruin. But delay here meant something else. Across the river, the torches were multiplying. If he hesitated, another would claim the road. If he advanced, he would meet them upon it. A frozen boundary invites conquest. It also invites reckoning. At last, he gave the command. The first ranks stepped onto the ice, shields raised instinctively as if expecting arrows from the sky itself. Boots made a dry, papery sound. The master of horse urged the animals forward with low murmurs, steady hands on reins. Wheels followed, carts of grain, barrels of salted pork, a chest of coin for mercenaries whose loyalty lasted only as long as silver. Each iron rim met the frozen surface with a groan that crawled into Edric's bones. The ice sang. Not loudly. Not yet. But the sound was deep and strained, like a great instrument pulled beyond its tuning. He rode forward to the edge, visor lifted. The air tasted clean and merciless, like a knife washed in snow. Beneath it lay the faint scent of sap from split wood, the sour tang of horse sweat turning sharp in cold. Across the way, movement quickened. Another army had begun to cross at the same time. Their banners inched toward collision, colors blurring beneath frost. Three forces stepping onto one narrow promise. Edric felt something twist within him, not fear, but recognition. The river had not frozen to help him. It had frozen to remove the last excuse for restraint. On moving water, men must negotiate. On ice, they must choose. The foremost cart creaked forward, its oxen snorting steam that vanished as quickly as it formed. The engineer called out measurements, voice tight. The chaplain raised the reliquary high, invoking saints whose names trembled in the cold. The ice answered with a sharper note. A crack blossomed beneath the cart's wheel, thin as a seam in glass. It raced outward, splitting the moon's reflection into fragments. The oxen lurched. Men shouted conflicting orders. Forward, back. The commands collided and dissolved. Edric's hand tightened on the reins. His horse shifted uneasily, iron shoes scraping. He saw in a single widening instant what lay beneath ambition. Not victory songs, not banners planted on conquered soil. Water, cold and patient. He remembered the peasants who paid tolls in spring, the ferryman who guided trembling hands across planks, the children who played at the bank when the thaw came. Their lives had depended on this boundary remaining inviolate. Now he was rewriting it with steel. The crack deepened. Another answered it, farther out. The ice bowed subtly beneath compounded weight. From across the river came a similar groan, a mirrored strain. The three armies were no longer separated by water, they were joined by fragility. A mule's harness bell swung uselessly, mute in the freezing air. The silence of that bell cut deeper than any horn. Edric thought of mercy, of turning back. But retreat on ice is as dangerous as advance. To hesitate now would scatter men, fracture discipline, invite chaos before the river itself claimed them. He had chosen. The ice would choose next. The foremost cart lurched again, one wheel dipping into blackness as the surface gave a finger's width. A soldier fell to his knees, gauntlet plunging through a sudden fissure. The engineer shouted for lighter loads. The master of horse cursed under his breath. Edric felt the future in the sharp silence that followed, a low, submerged roar waiting its turn. He closed his visor. Around him, the night held its breath. And as the cracks spread like veins beneath the weight of men who believed themselves masters of consequence, Lord Edric understood that this crossing would not be measured in miles gained or banners taken. It would be measured in what the river chose to remember. The ice groaned again, longer, deeper. Somewhere beneath that brittle plain, water was gathering its voice, and when it spoke, it would not ask permission. The first scream did not come from the ice. It came from a child, high and thin, torn from a throat too small for such terror. It slipped between huts and hedges, caught in chimney smoke, and vanished into the larger noise gathering along the river bend. The village had no name worth writing in a lord's ledger. It was a scatter of wattle and daub huts crouched behind a thorn hedge, roofs patched with thatch and prayer. In winter it smelled of smoke, pig fat, and wet earth that never quite surrendered to frost. The river curved around it like a protective arm, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel. For the villagers, the river was not a symbol. It was eels writhing in woven baskets. It was watercress gathered at dawn. It was the dark, slow current that took children who leaned too far chasing geese. They feared it the way one fears a moody neighbor, by respecting its moods. When it froze, it was not a convenience. It was an omen. Old Marta was the first to walk down the narrow track and touch it. She sold rushlights in the market and knew which herbs eased fever and which soothed a woman in childbirth. Her hands were cracked from lie and cold. She crouched at the bank and pressed her fingers against the pale surface. For a heartbeat, her skin clung to it. She pulled back sharply, sucking air between her teeth. Then she spat beside her and watched the spit sit on top of the glaze like a bead of glass. "It's sealed," she said. The word passed from mouth to mouth. Sealed, as if the river had been closed by decree. By dusk, strangers had arrived. Not the usual handful of soldiers who came to collect tax and grain and leave muddy prints on the inn's floor. These came in waves, whole rivers of men spilling into lanes too narrow for their shoulders. They stamped through doorways, knocking against lintels, dragging straw and snow into homes that had never held so many boots. They demanded eggs and onions, turnips and smoked fish. Sometimes they paid with clipped coin that felt lighter than it should. More often, they paid with threats spoken softly enough to seem polite. A boy carrying a loaf of rye had it snatched from his hands. His mother struck the soldier before she could stop herself. The red print of her palm bloomed on his cheek. She wept afterward as though she had struck a priest. Then came the second army. And the third. The village became a throat swallowing too much. Campfires sprouted along the riverbank like orange wounds in the snow. Sparks lifted and died in the dark. The smell of horse dung thickened the air, mixing with wood smoke and the sour stink of men who had marched for weeks without washing. A healer laid out leeches in a glass jar upon a trestle table. A friar offered confession to men who had not yet killed, but already felt guilty. A lord's cook turned a goose slowly over a spit, while villagers gnawed cold cabbage behind shuttered doors. Marta watched from behind a stack of firewood, shawl pulled tight beneath her chin. Her breath ghosted in front of her face. She listened to their languages collide, Latin murmurs, French commands, guttural oaths that sounded like stones grinding. She understood none of it except the hunger beneath. Hunger for food. Hunger for coin. Hunger for victory. Their eyes kept returning to the river, to the white road stretched beneath the moon. The river had always protected the village by being difficult, by swelling in spring and snarling in flood, by reminding men that crossing required patience, tolls, ferries, negotiation. Now it lay flat and shining, offering itself like a bridge, and bridges bring trouble. Near midnight, the bells from the monastery across the valley rang the hour. The sound seemed distant, muffled by snow and smoke. Marta held one of her rushlights close, watching its small flame tremble in the wind. At the edge of the frozen surface, soldiers gathered. They did not step forward at once. They prodded the ice with spear shafts, listening. They crossed themselves. They laughed too loudly. Then the first line moved, careful, reverent, as if approaching a relic. Boot met ice with a dry whisper. Another followed. Shields angled outward as though arrows might fall from the sky itself. Marta leaned forward despite herself. The ice shone unbroken. For a moment, she almost believed it would hold. A mule bearing sacks of grain stepped out, iron shoes scraping. Its harness bells swung but made no sound, stiffened by cold. The silence of that bell pressed against her ears harder than any clamor. From farther along the bank, she saw torches flicker on the opposite side. Another host edging onto the same white promise. 3 rivers of men. 1 fragile skin. The ice answered them. A long crack ran beneath the foremost ranks, thin and pale as lightning trapped in glass. It split the moon's reflection into jagged halves. The sound that followed was low and terrible, a groan like a giant waking beneath stone. The soldiers halted. For one suspended breath, nothing moved. Then another crack answered the first. A horse screamed. Men shouted conflicting orders that scattered into the cold. The mule's hoof slipped. A wagon lurched sideways, wheel biting into a seam that had not existed a moment before. Marta clutched her rushlight so tightly the wax softened against her palm. She understood then that the river's fear was not of drowning. It was of forgetting its purpose. A boundary keeps violence contained. A wall forces men to negotiate. A river in motion insists on humility. But a frozen boundary invites ambition. Invites men with weapons to believe they can walk anywhere. The first splinter broke free with a sound like tearing cloth. A soldier vanished to his thigh in black water. Others lunged to pull him back. The ice shattered outward beneath their combined weight. The groan became a roar. Not loud at first, more a deep submerged surge pushing upward. The white surface buckled. Dark water flashed through widening seams. Marta stumbled backward as villagers screamed and scattered. A child tripped in the snow and was dragged upright by frantic hands. Smoke from the campfire swirled wildly, as if drawn toward the breaking. She saw men fighting not enemies, but the surface itself, scrabbling for purchase on a plane that no longer promised support. She saw banners tilt and vanish. She saw a cart of coins slide toward a fissure and disappear with a splash that seemed small compared to its consequence. The river had found its voice again. And it was not gentle. The rushlight in Marta's hand guttered. For a heartbeat, she shielded it with her shawl, as if that tiny flame mattered against such upheaval. It did. It was the only light she could control. The ice continued to split, lines racing outward like veins beneath skin. Torches toppled and hissed in the dark water. Horses flailed. Commands dissolved into screams. And beyond the immediate chaos, Marta felt something larger shifting, something that would not end when the water settled. When a boundary disappears, men do not simply turn back. They look for someone to blame. She turned toward her hut, toward the hedge and the narrow lane where children once chased geese without fear of banners. Snow fell more thickly now, softening the edges of what had happened. Behind her, the river roared. Ahead, the village held its breath. And in that breath lay the next danger. Not the ice, not the drowning, but the reckoning that follows when armies survive their own folly and seek meaning in ruin. Marta shielded her flame and walked into the dark, knowing the river would freeze again someday. But the memory of this crossing would not. It would travel with the survivors, and it would demand its own price. The trumpet call sounded wrong, thin, strangled, as if the metal itself had gone numb in the cold and could not remember how to be loud. Its note shivered across the frozen river and faded without echo, swallowed by a silence too wide for brass. Marais of the borderlands spat into the snow and watched the spittle freeze before it struck the ground. He had been hired with a handshake and a purse heavy enough to bend his belt. Double pay if he lived to see spring. No questions asked about banners or bloodlines. He had no loyalty to kings, only to the weight of silver and the warmth of bread. He had crossed rivers under arrows and curses, over planks slick with rain, in boats that leaked and prayed. But never had he seen a river turn itself into a battlefield before a sword was drawn. The mercenary company camped on the near bank behind a line of wagons lashed together with rope. Rope was their true god. Rope that held shields tight to splintering frames. Rope that hauled siege beams. Rope that bound prisoners and sometimes friends. It creaked and stiffened tonight, fibers snapping like old hair in the cold. Men huddled close to one another, sharing a skin of thin wine that burned the throat and vanished in the chest. Their stew, cabbage, barley, and a scrap of pork fat was eaten from wooden bowls with fingers already cracked and bleeding. The smell of the camp was harsh comfort. Smoke, wet wool, horse breath, iron, and the faint sweet rot of apples kept too long in a sack. Marek walked the edge of the ice with his captain, pole axe balanced across his shoulder. He brought its butt down against the surface. The sound came back wrong. Too solid. Too confident. Across the river, torches multiplied. At first, they looked like wandering sparks. Then, they resolved into ranks. Another army. And beyond that, farther upriver, yet more lights like embers carried by a patient wind. 3 forces converging, each thinking the ice was a gift meant for them alone. From one side drifted Latin litanies, priests invoking saints whose bones lay far from this valley. From another came a rough winter song, sung in a tongue Marek did not know, its rhythm blunt as an axe striking wood. Above both, the river said nothing. Silence can be heavier than sound. He tightened the leather strap of his gauntlet and watched a clerk set up a small table on a sled near the wagons. The man nestled his inkpot in wool, shielding it from freezing. He was ready to record contracts and casualties, neat columns for names that would soon belong to widows. War always wanted a record, as if numbers could make slaughter respectable. Nearby, a healer laid out bandages and a saw. The teeth of it were already rimed white. Marek noticed small details, the kind that decide whether a man lives or dies, a buckle that would not fasten because it had frozen stiff, a horseshoe nail that snapped under weight, a lantern flame that guttered sideways in a sudden gust. The cold was not merely weather, it was an extra army, impartial and hungry. The order to move came again, this time carried by gesture rather than sound. The captain lifted his hand. Men straightened, shields rose, pride stiffened backs that hunger had bent. Marek stepped onto the ice with the first line. It felt slick beneath his boots, alive with tension, as though something vast lay pressed thin beneath his weight. He could feel it. Not movement, not yet, but the strain of being held in place. The ice held. Behind him, men cheered softly. Relief spilled into pride with dangerous speed. Pride is the quickest way to anger the gods. He glanced down. Through the clear surface, he saw trapped bubbles and dark weeds suspended as if mid-breath. The river was not gone. It was waiting, captured beneath glass. Halfway across, the sound came. Low. Spreading. A crack traveling faster than a running man. It made his teeth ache. The line faltered. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else muttered a curse. Ropes on the wagons creaked as wheels rolled onto the ice behind them, iron rims biting into the slick sheen. On the far side, another army advanced toward the same center point. Banners edged closer like knives drawn without clashing. The moon fractured into trembling shards beneath the crossing boots. Marek's captain hissed, "Keep moving." Movement meant momentum. Momentum meant survival. That was the belief. But ice does not care for belief. Another crack split outward, thin as a vein beneath skin. The surface sagged ever so slightly under compounded weight. Horses snorted, breath vanishing before it could cloud. Marek reached for the rope coiled at his belt. Rope had saved him from cliffs and crumbling walls. It had hauled him from ditches slick with blood. It had held ladders steady beneath arrow rain. He felt its coarse fibers through his glove. And understood. Rope cannot save you from a world that opens beneath your feet. The crack widened with a sound like tearing parchment. A man to his left dropped suddenly to one knee as the ice gave a finger's width. His shout sliced the night. 2 others grabbed him, dragging him upright, shields clattering. The river answered with a deeper groan. Not loud, but full, as if it were clearing its throat after long restraint. Behind them, wagons rolled farther onto the ice. The clerk clutched his ledger to his chest, eyes wide. The healer swore softly, clutching his saw as though it were a talisman. Across the way, the other army pressed forward too, unwilling to yield advantage. 3 wills driving toward one fragile meeting point. A bell began to ring in the distant village. Late, lonely. Its sound trembled through the cold air and seemed to hover above the frozen expanse like a warning no one wished to heed. Marek felt something shift beneath his boots, not a crack, but a tremor, a ripple traveling unseen below the clear surface. The ice shivered. A fissure raced past his right foot, splitting the moonlight into jagged pieces. A horse screamed. A wagon wheel lurched sideways, iron scraping desperately. Men shouted. Commands collided and vanished. The first true break came not as thunder, but as collapse. A slab of ice tilted, then plunged. Black water surged upward in a silent rush before sound followed, a roar that was not yet full river, but already doom. Marek stumbled backward as the man ahead of him vanished waist deep into darkness. Shields dropped. Hands reached. The rope at his belt felt suddenly useless, a relic of faith in surfaces that stayed where they were put. The river had found its voice. And it was vast. Water surged through widening seams, swallowing torchlight, pulling at boots, dragging iron downward. The ice did not shatter all at once. It fractured impatient, spreading lines, each one a sentence written in cold inevitability. Marek swung his poleaxe to steady himself, blade biting into a slab that shifted beneath him. He heard his captain shouting somewhere to the left, but the words were lost in the rising roar. The bell from the village continued to ring. Thin, persistent, as if marking not the hour, but the reckoning. Marek understood then that silver would not matter here, nor loyalty, nor pride. The river did not bargain. It did not care for contracts sealed with wax and witness. It cared only for weight, and men had brought too much of it. The ice beneath him shuddered again, and for a suspended heartbeat, he felt the world hesitate between holding and surrendering. Then, the crack beneath his boots widened, and the river claimed its due.